Hi guys. Hi guys. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vardhan, and I'm very excited to be here on Edureka Live with you guys. And as you all know, today's session is going to be completely about what is a DNS server and how to set it up in your machine. So do attend the entire session if you want to learn how to set up a bind DNS server in 10 simple steps. And I'm teaching you this topic on DNS today based on several requests that I received from participants in my previous session. So this is something that I have not covered before, and it's really exciting because setting up a DNS server is one of the biggest headaches that any Linux admin will face. So much so that they will shy away from doing this task. But the biggest benefit with DNS is that it needs to be configured only once. And once it's configured, there's no need to edit any of the settings unless, of course, there is a major network shutdown. So at that time, you might have to reconfigure the network. You have to reconfigure the maps, the network ports. But otherwise, it's a one-time task. So, having said that, you got to note that DNS is highly essential in every company, right? It's to basically get your own domain. So that's the importance. So this is one task that has to be done by every Linux administrator at some point of time in his life, and that's what I'm going to teach you. And before I get started, I also want to know how many of you are aware of what a DNS is. Can you people tell me by commenting in the comment box? Okay. So I have a mixed response here. Some of you people know what it is, and some of you do not. Well, don't worry, guys. I will first explain what is DNS, and only then I will discuss the 10 simple steps to configuring a bind DNS server. Right, and after that, of course, I will show you a practical demonstration of the very same. Right? Alright, so let me get started by first of all showing you my customary agenda slide. Alright? Okay, just 1 minute. Okay, continuing. Okay, so guys, so for the sake of newcomers in this session, I will quickly go through what is a DNS and how does the DNS work, right? And after that, I will explain the 10 simple steps that are needed to set up a bind DNS server. There are multiple DNS servers which you can set up. You can go for a bind DNS server, you can go for power DNS, you can go for unbound, but bind DNS is one of the most popular and the most common ones, and it can be used as a name server, and that's what I'm going to show you how to set up in 10 steps, right? And finally I will give you a demonstration of the very same. So guys, if you get any doubts during the session, you can raise them by putting them in the comment box, and either my team or I will myself answer them for you. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy Edureka Live for the next 30 minutes to learn something interesting, and that's a core of Linux administration. So enough talk, getting started with our first topic for today. First of all, what is a DNS, right? DNS stands for domain name system, and a domain name system, its main responsibility is to translate the internet domain or the host names to IP addresses and vice versa. Okay, well, most of you might know that every physical machine connected to the internet is identified by an IP address, but most of you might not know that these IPs are unique only inside that same domain. Okay, and another fact that you might not be aware of is that when you type a URL in your web browser, it gets automatically converted, right? Internally, it gets converted to another IP address, to its equivalent IP address of the server or of the website that you are trying to access. So that's what happens. And can anybody tell me why that happens? Why there's a conversion over there when you type in either google.com or yahoo.com on your web browser? Why does it internally get translated to an IP address? Can someone tell me that? Well, that is because the URL or the fully qualified domain names like google.com or facebook.com or yahoo.com, which are the actual addresses of any server or machine on the internet, they are only easy to remember for humans, right? So in a textual format in google.com or facebook.com, so in this form it's easy for humans to remember, but for computers it's easier to remember the addresses in the form of IP addresses. Okay, and hence to facilitate the machines to communicate with the right machine, when you type a URL in the browser, the domain name or the host name needs to be converted, and it has to be converted exactly, right? So you cannot have any mistake or error over there. So for that purpose, we have something called as a DNS, and that is a task of a DNS basically. So the task of translating between the IP address to a domain name or the fully qualified domain name. So that's what a DNS does, or that's what we call as a domain name system. Now, without the invention of DNS, our lives would have been very difficult, because we would have had to map the hostname entries of every machine that you want to communicate with to its IP address manually in the network tables, right? Because otherwise the DNS now does the work for us, but without the DNS we would have had to do it manually. So that's the big need for DNS. So every time you want someone from the outside world, right, on the internet, if you want them to access some of your servers, maybe one or two servers inside your domain, or maybe with the other machines in your domain, then you have to have a domain name, and you will have to set up a DNS so that it can map internally. It can allocate IP addresses locally to your machines, and it would act as the bridge that would create an interface for between you and the outside internet. So that IP address translation is what a DNS is going to do, and that's why it's really important. So the other thing is that the DNS that I'm talking about, it works on a concept which is similar to a client-server network communication architecture. Okay, and our systems here, right, it will be the DNS client. So if you're trying to use google.com or facebook.com from your machine, then your machine can be considered as a client, as a DNS client, and the client here will be sending the requests to a server. So let me just open up the image for that. So we have different systems here, right? So we have one DNS server, and then we have two clients. So basically, if we have a server which we are hosting inside our domain, then we'll have to install, or we'll have to set up DNS inside that particular server. Okay, now that is the example of the machine that you see on your left, and on the right you have the different DNS clients. Now these are nothing but the other machines that are trying to access your system. Now the concept here is that whenever any DNS client is going to send requests to the server, it will send through the web browser. So these web browsers, what you can either enter the IP address here, or you can enter the host name or the domain name, right? The fully qualified domain name. You can enter one of these two. And when you do that, the DNS server will internally convert that particular IP address to a host name. Or if you specify a host name like google.com, then it would resolve that particular google.com to google.com's appropriate IP address, right? Internal IP address, which would point to the server. So if you want to access a website, then you will have to be configured to that particular website's IP address. So that's what the DNS server is going to do for you. Okay, and what the role of the DNS server is, when you specify the host name, the server will return back the DNS, the server will return you back the IP address. So when you specify google.com, the DNS server is going to give back the IP address of google.com, and the act of calling the server or sending the server the request is called as a lookup request. Okay, and the DNS server, what it responds with, that's called a lookup response. Okay, so we can call them DNS lookup request, or you can simply call them lookup request. Similarly, you can just call them lookup response. And this what you see here, you can either send the IP address or you can send the host name here. Okay, in my case, you have two different images here. And in the first image, I've just shown you how the request goes to the server and how the response comes back from the server to the client. Okay, and here I've shown you that the client can access, or he can send a request in the form of an IP address. So if the client sends the IP address as a request, then the server would basically return this particular domain name or the host name, and vice versa. If the client sends the host name here, then the response that he would get back would be in the form of an IP address, right? And that IP address can be used to reach the actual server, right? So if we want to access google.com or facebook.com, the DNS server would basically return back the IP address of google.com, and then by using that IP address, we can reach google.com's server. So similarly, if you want to use the Gmail service, you will have an IP address which would be returned by the server, and that is what you use to reach the Google's Gmail mail service. So that's how things work, and that's the role of DNS, right? So it plays a very the role it plays is in the background. So it's not a very popular role, but it's really important because it converts the host names to IP addresses. And I've just by now I'm pretty sure that you would have understood how important this is. And the next thing that I want to tell is that of the way that you do your lookup requests. Okay, there's something called as forward lookup, and there's something called as reverse lookup. Now in this example, I told you that if you the client is basically sending an IP address to the DNS server. Okay, and that server is resolving that IP address's domain name, and it's returning that back to the client. So in this case, it's called a reverse lookup, right? So it's called reverse lookup because by definition, reverse lookup stands for resolving the IP address to the host name or the domain name. But in case of the DNS client sends the fully qualified domain name or the host name to the DNS server, and if the DNS server responds back to the DNS client with the IP address, then it would be a forward lookup. So these are two different types of lookups that you can do, and this is how the lookups happen internally. Okay, so these happen automatically using your browser, and that brings us to the end of this slide. Now moving on to the next slide, what I want to show you here is how the working of a DNS server is actually how that actually happens. So first of all, we have a local system for that. Okay, now let's assume this is my system, okay, and I want to reach google.com's server. So what's the first thing that I'm going to do? What I would do is I would open up my browser and I would type www.google.com, or I might type google.com's IP address if I know it, but well, if I don't, then I would have to type the host name, right? So that's going to be easier for me to reach So, because I can remember google.com instead of remembering the IP address. But even if I remember the IP address, I can type that in, and my local system would first of all send that particular request to my resolver. Now, this resolver is something that would lie inside my network operating system in my network. Okay, it would be built into my network operating system, and its main role is to basically help the network communication between you and the outside world. So it's going to help you communicate with the various IP addresses. So when you specify an IP address in your browser, then if it has the history of where it's located, then it would automatically start pinging that particular machine, or it would reach that server. Okay, but if it does not have that IP address, then it would have to manually search for that particular address from various other root servers which are there in the hierarchy. So in the hierarchy of DNS servers, we have the first we have is that of root server. Okay, and after root server we have two other servers. One is the TLD servers, which is called, we have the TLD servers, and then after that we have authoritative name servers. Now before I explain the other two, I want to first of all finish and explain what a root server is. Now the root server is basically going to be at the top of your DNS hierarchy. Okay, and there are going to be, and in fact there are just 13 sets of root servers around the world. So in the entire world, whatever domains are there, those domains can be identified by the root server. It's not going to point out exactly what is the location of the IP address or the machine that you are trying to access. Okay, it would not exactly give you the IP address, but it would point you in that direction. It would first of all tell you it would shortlist, and it would tell you where to look for. Supposing you want to let's taking the example of google.com again. If you want to access google.com, then what the root server is going to do is it's going to help you look for where the google.com server is present, and what it would do is it would send you back something called as a TLD server. Okay, it would send it back to the resolver, and then the resolver would have to access the TLD servers. Now the TLD servers stand for top level domain servers. Okay, now inside the top level domain servers, you'll have various information here. Supposing your server which you're trying to access, now if that comes under a .com domain, then it would have details with respect to those servers. And if your server that you're trying to access, if that's part of a .net domain, or if it's part of a .org domain, then all those details would be present inside the top level domain servers. Okay, now the root server will point to the top level domain server. So the root server would basically return the address of the top level domain servers to the resolver. The resolver would then look, it would access the top level domain server and then look for the IP address that it wants to access, right? The server that it wants to access. Now at this point of time also, it will not have the exact answer, because even the top level domain, it cannot give the exact IP address of the server which you are trying to access. It would give you the host name, or it would resolve you till the domain name where your IP address can be present. Because there are so many domains in the world, it would shortlist the domains. It would shortlist the domain where the IP that you want to access, where that is present. So when it returns that particular domain to the resolver what it can do is it can access that particular domain name by accessing the authoritative name server. So the top level domain server would return back the authoritative name server, and once you go to the authoritative name server, and over here if you look up or if you query the particular IP address that you want to, then you can reach that server. So if you want to reach google.com, and if you're doing it for the first time, and if your resolver does not have it locally, the address of google.com's server, if it does not have it locally, then it would first of all go to root server. It would get back the top level domain where google.com has been hosted, and that would come back to the resolver. So the resolver would then go to that particular top level domain server, and it would find out which is the name server of google.com. Okay, and when that information is returned back to the resolver, it would use that particular name server, and in the name server, of course, this is where Google's server is hosted, right? And by reaching the appropriate IP that is defined as the name server over here, then you can reach that particular service which you've requested. So similarly, every other website that you want to access, like facebook.com or yahoo.com or microsoft.com, everything works in this kind of a fashion. So for the first time, you would have to access them through these three primary servers. You would have to get the authoritative name server, but the benefit is once you get the authoritative name server once, then the resolver will basically save that address. So it would not have to look for this in the same fashion the next time. So the resolver would store that IP address in its cache, and at a later point of time, if that same system is accessing it, or if any other system in your domain is trying to access it, then it can just get the address of the name server in its local cache memory, and it can easily find out and easily access that server quicker. So here it acts as a proxy server in a way, and that is the benefit, right? So it reduces redundancy. So that's the benefit, one of the benefits of working with the DNS server. So it doesn't have to query the entire DNS. It doesn't have to query the entire DNS system all the time. Now on a high level, that's how the working of a DNS server is. And if you guys have any doubts, you can put that in the chat box, because the next topic that I'm going to go to is that of how to configure a bind DNS server in 10 simple steps. Okay, there are a number of DNS servers that you can go for. What I'm going to show you is that with the bind DNS server. This is one of the earliest servers that was used for which let people host domain names, and it's also the most in use today. Okay, so like I said, there are 10 simple steps, and first of all, the first step would be that of installing the DNS package. Okay, now since it's bind which I'm going to install, we issue the command yum install flag y bind. So the asterisk here represents the fact that I want to install all the associated packages of bind. Now there is something called as bind chroot and bind utils. Now those are also important for us to work with our bind DNS server. So by giving an asterisk, all the associated dependencies and packages of bind would be installed. Okay, and the second step would be that of configuring your network address. So if you're using eth0 to connect to the internet, then you would have to enter this particular ifconfig eth0 file, which controls your network port, and then you will have to make a few changes here. And to be precise, the changes are that initially under boot proto you would have DHCP. Okay, and excuse me, yeah, DHCP basically stands for Dynamic Host Control Protocol, and that would when DHCP is specified, your IP address at boot time, every time you boot, right, your IP address would be manually changing. So if we want to host a DNS server at your machine, then you would have to have a static IP address, because you cannot afford to have the IP address change every time on boot up, right? Supposing the system or the server crashes suddenly, then you should not have to come here and change it back to the old IP address. So to keep it constant, we specify static here. And what we do next is we need to specify the IP address of your machine, or the machine that you want to specify at the server. So in my case, since I want the DNS server in my machine, I'm specifying my own IP address, and that is 192.168.56.2. Okay, and then you got to also specify the network mask and then the gateway. Okay, now when you specify these three details, you can go to step 3, and in step 3 you have to assign a fully qualified domain name for your server. Okay, now since you're creating a name server for yourself at your end, you'll have to specify your host name. So a fully qualified domain name would be in this form, and this is what you have to update in place of your current host name. Alright, that makes up step 3. And moving on to step 4, we have to add an entry in the etc/hosts file. Okay, so the command to enter that is vim/etc/hosts. So vim is one of the most popular editors, and when you enter the host file, you need to add your IP address and specify the fully qualified domain name of the server. Okay, so my IP address along with the fully qualified domain name, that is dns1.vardhan.com, right? Because if you noticed in step 3, the fully qualified domain name that we set as the host name is dns1.vardhan.com, right? So this is what you have to set in your etc/hosts file also. Here you're assigning the host name as fully qualified domain name, and here what you're doing is you're configuring the hosts file so that this host name or this fully qualified domain name would show up for this particular IP address of yours. And in the next step, you have to configure the resolve.conf file. Okay, and in the resolve.conf file, you have to add these two lines. Okay, you have to, if there's any other details present in that file, then you have to delete them and you have to add these two lines. If you want to add your machine as the DNS server, then you have to add the line search space your domain name. So in my case, it would be vardhan.com. Okay, so that I would add here, and then you have to add it along with the name server, and you should say name server space the IP address of your machine. Okay, now in this step, I told you that you will have to configure this. Repeat. So guys, the thing is, this particular file, right, the name server, the line that you see here, this has to be configured in both the client and in the server. So if you want to access your server from some other outside machine, then over there you have to add this particular line name server and then specify the IP address of the server that you're trying to host, right? But well, that's in case of DNS client, but in case of a DNS server, you have to just specify both these lines of search and the domain name, followed by the name server and the IP address where you wanted to look for. So when you specify these two things, you would be done with your step 5. Now, the next step is to go to your named.conf file. So the named.conf file is the file that comes when you install bind. Okay, so this is where your actual DNS configuration starts with respect to bind. And in this named.conf file, you will have a number of lines. You'll have close to 15 to 20 lines of code, and what you need to concentrate on are just 3 lines. Okay, so under the inside the options tab, you will have this line which says listen on port 53. Okay, so you specified your port. It's specified that it would be hosted on port 53 in your system, and inside these curly braces you can see localhost, right? So by default this would be the settings. Now you have to replace this localhost with the IP address of your server or your machine, okay, where you want to host DNS. So you have to replace localhost with the IP address, and right after that line you will have this line which says listen on version 6. That's basically IPv6 port. So this you need to comment this line because we don't need to use this. Okay, so just comment it, and finally you will have one more line which says allow query none. Okay, so you have to replace none with any. That's what you got to do in step number 6. And once you've done with that, let's go to step number 7. And we have another file here, which is the rfc.1912.zones. Okay. Now these two files, the named.conf file and the rfc.1912.zones, these two files would come along with bind when you install bind. And when you go to the rfc.1912.zones, you will have a number of options, okay, where you have to specify your domain name. In my case, it's going to be vardhan.com. So that is what I'm specifying for the zone of mine. Okay, I will explain the entire file in detail when I open up my VM, but what you need to understand now is you'll have the zone and you'll have to specify the domain name or the host name like this, and specify that it's a forward.zone. Okay, and then you'll have another zone for the reverse dot zone, okay, for the reverse dot zone file, and you have to specify the IP address in reverse format. So that's because of the concept that I explained earlier, right? If you do a lookup, if you do a forward lookup, so a forward lookup is where you're resolving by giving a domain name. So at that time, it would use the settings in this zone file. But in case if you're searching by using an IP address, so at that time, it would use the reverse lookup file. Okay, so if you don't have a reverse zone for your DNS configuration, then if they search you by using IP address, even if your IP address is correct and if they type it, then they cannot reach you because that would not be specified in your DNS configurations, right? In your reverse zone configuration, it's not specified. So that is the thing. But this, of course, is the most important part, where you at least specify the domain name, and by doing this, the forward.zone file would internally resolve vardhan.com to the IP address that you specify to. Okay, now these are the four important changes that you have to make inside this particular file. Okay, and this makes up step number 7. And moving on to step number 8, we have to create the actual forward and reverse zones. Okay, now what we have done here is in step number 7, we just said that we have a forward.zone file and we have a reverse.zone file. Okay, and when someone searches in the URL, if they search by the hostname vardhan.com, then it would look for settings in the forward.zone. Okay, and if someone search using this IP address, then it should look for the reverse.zone file. So that we have only specified where to look for, okay, in this step number 7. In step number 8 is where you actually define the rules for the reverse and the forward lookup. Okay, so that's why we have to create these two forward and reverse zones, and we'll have to modify them with your host name. Okay, now when someone searches your host name, at that time you have to create one zone for that, and when someone searches for your server by the IP address, we have to again configure the reverse zone at that time and replace that with your IP address, so with your reverse IP address. So this is the third important step when it comes to bind DNS. Okay, now this gets a little tricky over here, and you might not understand right now, but I promise you that I can explain it in a better fashion when I open my VM and show you the entire setup, right? And yeah, when you've done with these 3 files, then your work is done. You just need to change the group ownership of these 2 files which you created. So you've created the forward and reverse dot zones, and once you specify all the settings also, just change the group and you're all good. You can just restart the DNS server, which will be the final step, and then your bind DNS server is set up. Okay, and the command to do that is service named restart. So these are the 10 simple steps which are needed to set up a bind DNS configuration at your end. And if there are no questions, I can move forward and I can show you a demonstration of the same, right? And to show you a demonstration, what I'm going to do is I have to first of all open up my VM, right? So give me a minute. Let me just open up my virtual machine. So guys, can you see my virtual machine on the screen? Can you quickly give me a confirmation? Okay, so I suppose it's all working. Oops. All right, guys. So like I said, the first of all, the most important thing that you have to do is you have to install DNS, right? So the command to install DNS is sudo. Okay, let me just enter as a root user by specifying su. Okay. Now the command is yum install bind, right? So here we go. Right now I have installed the latest version of bind already, so I don't need to do anything. Okay, but anyways, this was the first step that I wanted to show you. Now let me just go back to the step that I want to show you here. Okay, so the second step, as it says, you have to configure the static IP address. Okay, you have to make sure that your machine that you're working on, that is a static IP address, and its IP address does not change, and that has to be configured over here. Okay, so let me just go back to the VM, and that file is present under etc. under sysconfig network scripts actually, and here we have if config eth0, right? So okay, in my case I have eth0 and eth1, but we would still be configuring only eth0 file. Okay, and when I did a cat, this was the information that I got. Now let me also open this from my Vim editor so that you can see it in a better fashion. So what I'm saying is it's my device is at 0. That's my connection. This is my hardware address. I don't need to make any changes here. And pretty much on boot is yes. Network manager, if it's controlled, I'm gonna say yes for network manager being controlled. And the change with respect to your system would be in this line. Okay, for the first time when you're configuring it, it would be DHCP, and I have manually changed it to static over here, right? And then if you see the IP address, I have set my own IP address. So let's just verify what's my IP address once by running the ifconfig command. And yeah, my IP address is 192.168.56.2, and that's exactly what is specified over here. Now the network mask is 255.255.255, and the gateway is this. Okay, so this is all good in this particular file of mine. Now the next step would be that of assigning a fully qualified domain name for my server. Okay, and that I need to configure by going to this particular file, etc/etc/sysconfig/networks file. So going back to my VM here, let me do a cat, and yeah, this is what the file is. So when I hit enter, you can see that my hostname is already set. It says hostname is equal to dns1.vardhan.com. That's because I set it manually a couple of minutes back. And for the first time when you're doing it, you would probably get your machine name over here, right? Your machine name or host name. Supposing, well, in my case, let me tell you what was there. It was written Edreka because my VM's name is Edreka, right? So that's what initially would be here. But that's what you have to change, okay? And when you change, you're all good. So we can go to the next step, and in my case the next step is to configure the etc/hosts file. And as you can see, the etc/hosts file, you have to add your IP address along with your fully qualified domain name. Now let's say hosts, and it's already, that line is already there again. So I have 192.168.56.2, and I also have my fully qualified domain name set, right? Now what's the next step? It is that of going to etc/resolve.conf file and adding your domain name over there, okay, along with the name server. You're specifying that this particular IP address is acting as a name server, okay? So name server is the most important line, and this particular line would have to be entered in both your DNS server and in your DNS client. So when I say DNS client, basically if you want any other machine to reach your server or your machine, then you would have to have this line over there. So that's the thing. Now let me just go back to my VM and show you that also. It's under etc/resolve.conf file, right? So right now there is that line is missing, and this might mean that DNS does not work in my system. So let me configure that by doing a vim. Okay, so it says search vardhan.com. That's absolutely correct, but we have no IP address specified, so that's what I'm going to enter over here. I'm going to enter my IP address, that is 192.168.56.2. Well, actually I need to give a name server, right? Okay, so this is good. Name server space the IP address, and I'm just going to save and quit. And if I do a cat resolve conf again, I've got it in the format that I wanted. Okay, search and my domain name followed by name server, and I'm specifying the IP address of my name server. Great. So going back to my PPT, the next step is to configure the named.conf file. Okay, now this is a bind package. So I would find all these bind packages inside this. I would first of all find them in my etc file, etc folder. So these are the list of configurations that we have to do inside there. Okay, so again going back to my VM, and let me do a cat named.conf, and as you can see, this is that file that starts from right here. Let me also open this using Vim. Okay, now I hope it looks better to you people. And this was a change that had to be done. So this is already changed, right? So there would be localhost over here. I've replaced that with my IP address, and I've commented out this line which says version 6 IPv6 port, and these are the other lines which say where your directory is present. My bind directory is present over here in /var/named. So this is where my reverse zone and my forward zone, all those would be present over here. Okay, and if there are any log files, those would be present inside my dump, and statistics files would be present here. So we have all these details present over here. Now the other change that we have to do is in this line we have the allow query, right? So initially we would have something called none over here, so we have to replace none with any, right? So when you've done these three changes, you're all good. You just need to verify one more thing, and that is if it says include /etc/namd.rfc1912.zones. That is because it's this file inside which we are specifying which are the forward zones and the reverse zones. Okay, so it's important that this line is present, because your named would look for this zone file, and from here it would be redirected to the forward zone and the appropriate reverse zones. So once this is done, I can go to my next step, and my next step is to configure my rfc.1912.zones, correct? So let me hit the command for that. There we go. And as you can see, initially you would have a junk value over here. Okay, so I replaced that with my particular domain name, that is vardhan.com. And similarly I've specified that vardhan.com, and someone searches for vardhan.com, the settings for that lookup, for that forward lookup, would be present in this file forward.zone. Okay, and my bind DNS would also know where to look for, because I've specified the directory, and this forward.zone would be present inside the directory which I just showed you earlier, that is /var/named. Okay, so as of now we have not created that, but yeah, I'm just letting you know that these forward.zone, which is specifying that the rules are present inside this file, this would be present in that directory of mine. Okay, now when you specified forward.zone here, you're done with one part. Now the next part is to set up your reverse zone. Okay, so if someone searches by the IP address, so they'll have to resolve to the host name, right? Sorry, to your domain name, right? So for that you specify that in reverse fashion. If it's 192.168.56.2, if that's my IP address, then I would resolve it in this format. And I'm ignoring the last subnet, that is .2, because if they are accessing any system inside my domain, then they would be resolved, then they would be shown my domain name. So that is the reason I'm ignoring the last subnet. Then this would all come under the same class. So that's the concept here. And these are the other rules which you don't need to worry about. You don't need to make any changes over here. Okay, .n/addr.arpa. So these are no changes need to be done here. You just need to make sure that you set your IP address in the reverse fashion over here before the dot symbol, and then you have to specify that the settings for this reverse lookup would be present in the file called reverse.zone inside the same directory. Okay, inside the /named directory. And we are saying allow update none. Okay, so no changes over here again. So I'm just going to quit this and going to my 8th step, and this is where I would be creating the forward and reverse zones. Okay, now to create the forward and reverse zones, you have a basic template, right? Let me just print out what is the template that we would be getting. So inside my var file, I have named, right? So over here, as you can see, there is something called as named.localhost. So this is the template that would which we can use for creating our forward and reverse zones. So I did a copy paste of this one. So I copied the named.localhost and I created two files, forward zone and reverse zone. Okay, now let me show you what is there inside each of these two files. So inside my forward zone, there was another junk line over here, and that you have to replace it with your actual domain name. Okay, the fully qualified domain name that I set is dns1.vardhan.com dot root.dns.vardhan.com. So you need to note there's a dot after every time you specify your domain name. Okay, so you have to remember that rule. So when you specify these two things, you're all good, and then you're saying internet name server, because my domain name that is present here, it's acting as a name server. So I'm defining that here, and I'm saying the DNS1 is acting as the address for this particular IP address. So this would be the two important lines which you would have to modify in your forward.zone along with this definition. Okay, and similarly in your reverse.zones, so let me just type reverse dot oops, yeah, when I type this, you can see that there's not much of a difference. The first line is the same. Okay, so IN basically stands for internet, SOA stands for state of authority, and when you say @ it means all. Okay, so it says every time, always, as whenever there's a search for dns1.vardhan.com, then from the root server, that time these rules would stand, and these are the actual settings. Okay, these were the settings I explained, which would be part of your forward zone, and the only difference that you could probably notice over here is that you can see that well, even this line is the same, right? So here also you've specified that your name server is dns1.vardhan.com. okay, now the changes in the final line, here we've specified dns1 because this is a forward lookup. Okay, but in case of a reverse lookup, since my IP address is 192.168.56.2, I've specified 2 over here, and whenever there's a lookup for 2, then at that point of time we would be using the same dns1.vardhan.com. okay, so instead here we are resolving from the domain name to the IP address. In this case, it would be from the domain name to my it would be from my IP address to my domain name, right? In the rfc1912.zones file, we specified the first 3 subnets, that is 192.168.56, right? We specify that in reverse fashion. So here I'm specifying the final class along with the domain name that this should resolve to. So whenever there's a search, it should resolve to this particular domain name. So that's what we've specified in the reverse.zones file. Now that is pretty much the end of the step 8, and also one of the last steps, because this is a very simple step where you just change the group ownership of these two files. Okay, and then after that you basically restart the DNS service. So if you want to again change the group ownership, you can supply the command ch group. You can specify named followed by the path of your file, that is /etc/named /var/named/reverse zone. You can specify that in this format, but I don't need to do it because I've already done that, right? So my ownership has already changed, so I'm gonna skip this simple step, and I'm gonna go to the final step, that is restarting your named service. So to restart your named service, the command is service named restart. Okay, it's a very simple command again, and this would basically stop my named for a moment and restart it, and it says the status is okay. That's great. Now comes the well, by now your DNS is set up, but you need to always check if your DNS is set up, right? So if you want to check if it's set up, you can basically run this operation dig. So when you do a dig, it would say what is the status. Okay, and the answer that I've got is basically that the status, there's no error, my ID is this, and my name service rules are present over here. It's all good. Okay, and it's also saying that my server address is 192.168.56.2, and in this address it's hosted under port number 53, right? Exactly the address that we specified in our configuration files, and this is exactly the response that we wanted. Now, to verify if I can, things are actually working, there's one more command, that is the ns lookup command, which most of you might be aware of. So you say ns lookup followed by the domain name. The domain name that I set is dns1.vardhan.com. So when I hit an enter, look at the response that you get. It says the server is this one, is the IP address of my very own machine, and it says the address where it's hosted is in this IP, port number 53 inside this IP, and it says the name of my domain is this one, and again you will have your IP address. So this basically means that my address is all up and running. It's all great. It's perfect. So everything's fine. Okay. So there's no problem here, but there is something you might also need to check. If you want to check if your domain is accessible from a different machine, then you can do that. Okay, and for that purpose, we'll have to open up your other VM. Okay, so in my case, I'm going to open up my second virtual machine, and I'm going to ping the same thing. Okay, so I did a ns lookup to this domain, right? So I'm going to run the same command from a different domain to just verify and check if my domain is actually accessible from the other machines also. So I'll copy this command and I would just paste it here. Okay, so let's see what's the deal. Okay, my internet is not working, so that was the minor issue. So no problem. I'm going to resupply the command after my network is up. Okay. Okay, so it's giving me a different address, right? So the reason for this is the name server would not have been set. So for that, let me go and edit the resolve.conf file that I explained earlier, right? So from the client side, you have to resolve that. So etc resolve.conf file and oops. Okay, so yeah, the name server has been specified, but the IP address is not correct. So if I want to specify the IP address of the name server, then I have to specify that VM's IP address, and that is 56.2. So I'm gonna save this and exit. Okay, now if I try doing a lookup, I would get the exact address that I wanted. So perfect. I'm getting my address, the port number is appropriate, the domain name is correct, and also my final address. So this is how you publish your domain name to the internet. Okay, so at this point of time, from anywhere in the world, if you access this particular IP address, then you would be able to get these details. You would get my domain name, and you would get if you basically do a lookup with my domain name, you would get back my IP address, and if you do a lookup with my IP address, you would get back my domain name. So let me even show you the other way how it works. So here we have done a lookup with the domain name. So here let me give my IP address and do a reverse lookup, right? So it's in this way, right? Oops, it's .2. Yeah, perfect. So it says the domain name is dns1.vardhan.com, correct, and the IP address is the same. So that's it, guys. So that's how the domain name configuration is done, and yeah, that's pretty much the end of my session.